How's that? Does that sound better? Yeah. Well, this morning, if you may have noticed on the back of the bulletin, I've got loved, abused, betrayed, and accused. Doesn't sound like too much fun, does it? You know, what we're going to look at, and for most here, it's going to be very familiar. For some, it may not be as familiar, but thinking along those lines, I mean, if you have somebody that starts out in life and they recognize what love is. They feel very loved. They recognize it. It's something that is a part of their life, or at least maybe from one person, maybe from more than one, but at least from one. Maybe it's a parent. And you recognize what it is to be loved, but then you go through something. You have something that happens to you that is abuse. And then it comes to a point that it's worse than just abuse, it's betrayal. And then because perhaps even of the things that are happening to you with all of that, you yourself are accused. Anybody think of lives that happens in? I mean, we all go through circumstances in life, but if you think about that for a few moments, I mean, does that sadden anybody else besides me? I mean, to think about somebody going through these things in life and experiencing these things in life. There was a guy that we read of in Scripture, and he's extremely famous. A lot of people who don't know the Bible have heard the name Joseph, right? I mean, he started out really well, at least from his father's standpoint, and the way that his father seen him. So if you want to turn over there to Genesis, there may be a few places in here where we'll read, but maybe other places in here that we won't stop to really read about it, but at least talk about it. The story of Joseph is an amazing one. Just the family line coming down to that point, and what's taken place up to that point. But when we recognize Joseph being born, and from Jacob's perspective, his father's, he is one that is born in his old age, and of course we know that Benjamin is younger, but he loves Joseph very much. I mean, he loves Joseph so much, and actually more than the rest of his brothers, and some of them are grown men by this time. Joseph is 17 years old when we're first really kind of introduced to who he is. I mean, we know that he's born. We don't know anything about him. At 17 years old, we start learning a little bit about him, and that's what we're kind of talking about right now, that he was so loved by his father that his father made this special tunic, or I think King James says coat, but it would have been more probably like a tunic that was multiple colors. And, you know, movies have been made about this, and songs written about it, and things like that. But he loved Joseph. Joseph was an interesting character when he was a young guy, and he was probably, I mean, if you think about a 17-year-old boy, and you think about even how he's honest about his feelings, I mean, it didn't always come across good to his brothers. He had given a bad report already to his father about his brothers. It doesn't really say what they were doing, but Joseph was out there in the field, and he actually was even taking care of the flocks, even by himself it seems, because he was out there when his father calls him in and sends him out to his brothers. But before this point, he's already brought at least one bad report about his brothers, so his brothers don't like him. Plus he's having these dreams. And these dreams are coming to him, and he has this dream of that they're all out there in the field, and they're putting up the sheaves of the probably barley. It could be even the corn stalks. I mean, I remember my grandfather doing that, taking corn stalks and putting them up and tying them together. They were so much fun to hide inside. You know, you could get inside there and throw corn cobs at each other and things like that when it's supposed to be drying out. But he has this dream of these sheaves And it just so happens that his, that he puts up, stands up, and all the rest of them bow down to his. And they don't like this, because if they are all being represented within in these sheaths that are being put up, then that means they're bowing down to Joseph. And they say, what, are we going to bow down to you? Is that what you're telling us? And so then there's the sun and the moon. He has this other dream, the sun and the moon and 11 stars and his, or rather him. It doesn't really, it just says these 11 stars, but the sun and the moon and the 11 stars are bowing down to him. Now that's an interesting dream. But even Jacob at that point says, are you saying that your mother and I and all of your brothers are going to bow down to you? Now the brothers don't like this, and they start plotting against him at this point. But it says Jacob kind of thinks about this and stores this away. I mean, Jacob he's seen some things in life that most people don't see. I mean, he's wrestled with God. I mean, Jacob has been through some things. He's heard the stories even coming down from his grandfather Abraham. And so Jacob this is his son, and his favorite son, nonetheless, which probably was what was causing a lot of the problem to start with. But he was having these dreams, and he kind of stores this away. Well, when he tells him go out and check on his brothers out in the field, of course, he goes out there, and they see him coming from quite a ways, and they say, let's kill him. Let's get rid of him. This dreamer, here he comes. Reuben says, no, don't kill him. Let's not kill him. There's a lot of pits out here, and you kind of get the idea maybe they had tried to dig a lot of wells, and not everywhere that they would dig a well. It doesn't really say it. It just seems like there's a lot of pits out there, because they meant put him in one of the pits. And so there's this plan to do this, and he plans to go back later and get him. and so he's gonna rescue him. So this speaks highly of Reuben. Well, Reuben evidently doesn't stay with them, and they seize him, and they put him in one of these pits, and they're eating lunch, and they see these foreigners coming, and Judah says, hey, look, there's some foreigners coming. Let's not put him to death. Let's not do that. Let's sell him, and we'll tell our father, that he's disappeared. He's gone. And so they end up selling him, and he's carried off with this caravan down to Egypt. And Reuben comes looking for him, can't find him, and he comes to the rest of the brothers. He says, where is he? I don't know where to look. What am I going to do now? He feels a responsibility. And so they end up taking this coat or this tunic that had been made for Joseph. They put blood on it of an animal, and they take it back to Joseph or to Jacob, and they say he must have been killed. Isn't this his? Jacob sees it, and he has to conclude he's been killed in the wilderness. That's his coat. There's blood on it. His son must be dead. Well, Joseph, here we get to the point where Joseph understands what it is to be loved, even to be loved above the rest of his brothers. He's experiencing that from his father, but he's being sorely abused, and now completely betrayed by his brothers, that they're letting their father know that he must be dead. They've sold their brother. They have sold him into slavery and sent him off, and they think that they're probably never going to see him again. So this betrayal takes place, and you've got to think, how does Joseph deal with this? How do people deal with things like this in life? Abuse in life. By family members, nonetheless. Whether it's being abused or whether it's being betrayed completely, as in this particular case, he has no way. There's no way that he can get back. He's gone down in Egypt. He's a slave now. You can think this is a 17-year-old. What must be going through his mind? He goes to Egypt, and this guy named Potiphar buys him And he's a powerful man, and we see some of the things that happened to Joseph, kind of surrounding all this. It says in chapter 39, verse 1, and Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. It says the Lord was with Joseph, so that he became a successful man. Now, how in the world does a slave become a successful man? Nonetheless, a slave, a 17-year-old that is being carried off by the Ishmaelites down to Egypt, and having experienced the betrayal and the abuse of his brothers toward him, having known the love of his father that he is now separated from, with no hope of ever seeing him again, how would we handle this situation? What if, there can be all kinds of what ifs, but what if this country becomes no more? And we are taken away from each other and away from family, that we have no hope of seeing them again. Across borders, maybe across seas, taken to other places, and we find ourselves slaves. Does anybody do you really want to think about that? No. But if we do, how are we going to react to that? What is going to be our response? When small things, in comparison to that, would you consider that a huge thing if that would happen? That would be major. That life-shattering. That would change everything about what's happening around us. Probably, people speaking in different languages, we wouldn't understand them. We'd try to learn. But coming from a 17-year-old's point of view, we know how we would react. How would we expect them to react? Lash out in anger? Do everything that they can to try to escape, to go back home? Would we not try to do what we could to get out of the situation? He wasn't doing any of this. He was bought by Potiphar, and it says God was blessing him. He started taking care of Potiphar's things seemingly as if it were his own or as God's, and doing that in such a way that Potiphar put him over everything that it was in his house. He did so well as a servant or as a slave that Potiphar said, there is nothing of my affairs that I want to handle on my own. I've got things out there to do. You take care of everything in my household. He did well. God blessed him with it. It just so happened that he was a fine-looking young man. And Potiphar's wife noticed that, and she desired him. She tried several occasions to get him to come and sleep with her. He wouldn't do it. He said, my master Potiphar has put me over everything in the house. There is nothing that is withheld from me. He said he didn't have to worry about anything. He had a place to stay. He would have had fine clothes. He had things to eat. He didn't have to worry about anything of what he was going to be provided in this household. He has left everything at my charge. I'm over everything in the house except for you, and that's because you're his wife. Well, one day he went in the house, taking care of some business. No other servants, no other people were in the house. And she said, come and sleep with me. She grabbed a hold of him, and he left his garment, and he ran out of the house. When she realized just what had happened, and she had his garment, of course, she went with this, and probably being hurt, probably in spite, because he was rejecting her, and she was being rejected. She said, he came and attacked me. She called the servants in. The rest of the servants said, he attacked me. See, here's his clothes right here on the floor. And she left him that way until Potiphar got home, and Potiphar seen it. He was furious with rage, and he had him thrown into prison. Accused. He didn't do it. He really didn't do it. But because he was accused of doing it, and because of Potiphar's prominence, I mean, there was evidently no question to ask whatsoever. There wasn't anything like a trial. He was thrown in prison. I mean, what would you do by this point? Would you think, I mean, there is no hope for me. Everything I do seems to eventually fall to pieces. I had it made in my father's house, and I ended up sold into slavery. I had it made in Potiphar's house, and now look at me. I'm in jail. Later on, he's going to call it a dungeon or a pit. That's where he's at. I mean, every reason at this point to say, forget this, I'm done. He didn't. He continued to remember who God was. He continued to place his faith in God, and he excelled in prison. The guy who was over all of the prison saw that everything that Joseph did was turning out good. I mean, he would put different prisoners in charge of different things. It was working well, and he ended up putting Joseph over all the prisoners. I mean, I guess he was a trustee, you might say, to some degree. He was over everybody. So you can kind of get, I mean, here's the head guy, and he can kind of sit back and let Joseph take care of these things because he's doing well. And it just so happens that the cupbearer to Pharaoh and the baker to Pharaoh, they had been thrown into the prison as well. You know, and you kind of get this, I mean, this mind picture, I do anyway. I mean, Pharaoh gets mad about something and throw him in jail. He can do whatever he wants to, whenever he wants to, right? And that's what he did. These guys were in jail. It doesn't really say what they did, but they both had dreams one night. I mean, the cupbearer had this dream that there were branches, and the branches bloomed. There were 3 of them that came out, and when they bloomed, then all of a sudden they had these luscious grapes on them. And these grapes produce wine for Pharaoh, and the cupbearer is able to give it to Pharaoh, the king, and serve it to him. There was another dream by the baker that was similar in nature, and he describes his dream in being this way. He said, there were 3 baskets of white bread on my head, and in the top basket there were some of all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, and the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. So they both have dreams, and there's 3 involved, and they're talking about, you know, what these dreams mean. And Joseph says, God knows. It's interesting, Joseph is giving God the credit. Joseph isn't taking the credit, but he says God knows, and so he says, here's what's going to happen to you, and he's talking to the cupbearer, and he says, in 3 days, you're going to find favor, and you're going to be taken before Pharaoh, and you're going to find favor in his sight, and you're going to be restored as cupbearer. So the baker, and this is when the baker describes his dream to him, he said, I had a dream too. And you can almost sense the excitement. I had a dream, and so he tells him this dream, and he's got these 3 baskets of bread on his head, and the birds light on it, and they're eating off. All of a sudden, I mean, you have to get this idea. Wait a second, birds are eating the bread. This doesn't sound good, and it's not. He says 3 days, and he said you're going to go before Pharaoh, and he's going to hang you on a tree, and birds are going to eat your flesh. 2 different outcomes, these 2 dreams. But he tells the cupbearer, when he tells him about the dream, he said, remember me. When this happens to you, you remember me. You tell Pharaoh about me. And so, sure enough, 3 days, they're both taken out. They go before Pharaoh. The cupbearer is restored. The baker, he's hung. But the cupbearer doesn't say anything about Joseph. But time goes on. Pharaoh has a couple of dreams. I mean, he dreams that there's some cows that come up out of the Nile River that look very, very good. I mean, they're fat. They look good. Their form is good. There's 7 of them. They come up, and then there's 7 ugly cows. I mean, these scrawny-looking cows come up, and it says they eat all of the fat cows, but you don't even notice. You can't, by looking at them, you can't see that they've ate anything. But they eat up the 7 fat cows. Pharaoh had another dream, and there was this stalk, and 7 ears of grain came out on the stalk, and they looked very good. But then right after that, 7 ears came out, and they didn't have anything on them. You ever picked an ear of corn expecting to get something? There's just kind of spotty things inside there. Not very many rows, and maybe just corn here and there on the ear of corn. That's kind of what I get pictured in my head, but it says they consumed the others. It's almost like you would get the picture, it just kind of pushed them out of the way, the others fell off, and here were the 7 bad ones. Well, Pharaoh wants to know, what does this mean? Does this mean something? And he called everybody together to try to figure it out. They couldn't figure it out, and the cupbearer says, wait a second. There's this guy, Joseph, in the prison, and he told me and the baker both our dreams, and both of those dreams were fulfilled. So he calls for Joseph, and he says, I hear that you can interpret dreams. And he said, I can't. God can. Again, Joseph and his response is incredible. Our response to having known what love is and then to be abused and betrayed and then accused of things and then end up where Joseph would have been at this point, what would our response be? Really, what would our response be? I don't know that, folks, that mine would be that good. The only way that I can judge that is through various things that I go through in life. I mean, how about you? And what our response is to various things that happen to us in life that aren't pleasant, that we don't like, and what is our response to that? But Joseph continues, and even at this point saying, I don't. It's not in me to interpret the dreams. God knows them. What are your dreams? So Pharaoh tells him, and he says, well, here's what's going to happen. There's going to be 7 good years in all of the land, and there's going to be abundance that will be grown, and the harvest will be great. But after that, there's going to be 7 years that are going to completely consume everything that's going to be grown in these first 7. There's going to be 7 years that will completely wipe out what everybody has from these 7 good years. He says, here's what you need to do, Pharaoh. You need to find somebody of wisdom, somebody of knowledge and wisdom in your kingdom, and appoint him to take care of these 7 years so that everything is stored up right, so that when these 7 bad years hit, then Egypt is going to be blessed. And Pharaoh, I mean, he just responds with this of, there is nobody wiser than you. You've just told me what's going to happen. There is nobody wiser than you in my kingdom. I'm putting you in charge. And the same thing that happened in Potiphar's house and the same thing that happened in the jail ends up happening to Joseph over the whole land. It says he puts a signet ring on his finger. I mean, that is the seal of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, though I am Pharaoh, I am king, other than this throne, that's all that I have over you. You're in charge of everything. If you say it, that's what people are going to do. And he sends word out through the land. He puts Joseph in the chariot right behind him. I mean, when they go anywhere, Joseph, he's the guy. I mean, Pharaoh's got it made now. He doesn't even have to make any decisions. He's got Joseph. We know the story. The 7 years, good years are happening. They start storing up. He has them stored in every city. I mean, they start storing this food. They put guards on it, of course, and they're storing away this food. I mean, they put this tax on the people. A fifth the people are going to have to give to Pharaoh. And they do. And so they start bringing in all of this grain. And of course, there's abundance. I mean, they're doing very well. And so they start bringing all this grain, and Pharaoh stores it up. Actually, Joseph has it stored up. And then the bad years hit, and they end up 2 years into the bad years, and the Canaanites are hungry. They're going to have something, and Jacob is looking. And it's interesting because by this point, I mean, there's some interesting things happen in between here. Judah is, I mean, he's had grown sons by now. And you know, these guys are growing older, but Jacob's still in charge back home. I mean, that's a culture that we're not so much used to. I mean, we leave home, we have our own family, and we're in charge of the house, right? But Jacob is still in charge, and he basically tells these guys, what are you standing around for? Go up to Egypt and get us some food before we all die, before we all starve. And they end up going up there, and of course they end up right before Joseph. Joseph knows who they are. He recognizes them right away. And first he accuses them of being spies. He kind of plays with the situation a little bit. He accuses them of being spies. He ends up, saying if they're not spies, then he asks them some questions, and they talk about their family. They even talk about him. There's 12 brothers. One's dead, and they've got a little brother at home. Well, he wants to see the little brother. So you got to leave somebody here. And so they do. They go back. They end up finally coming back. Jacob, he's not wanting to let Benjamin go. He said, look what happened to Joseph. I'm not going to let Benjamin go. What if I don't get him back? But eventually, I mean, all of this happens. They go down there, and there's even the hiding of a goblet, a silver goblet, in Benjamin's saddlebag, if you will, as they return back. I mean, Joseph both times has sent the money back with them as they came to buy the grain with. They're scared to death that they're going to be accused of stealing that. So they end up taking it back. Jacob says, take it all back. You know, they wait quite some time before he finally lets them go. But Joseph, recognizing these things, even having a couple of times as he's talking to them, he has to turn around and leave the room and go to his own chamber and weep. It says he washes his face and then he comes back out so that he can get it together here. But he sends them away with this goblet hid in there because he's going to keep Benjamin there. And they come back. He has them brought back. They've stolen from him. Well, really, they didn't. But when they come back, Reuben's willing to give himself. He says, please, no. This will kill our father. You can't do this. This will kill him. This will send him to the grave. He said so himself. You can't keep Benjamin here. Keep me in his place. And that's, if you will, the straw that broke the camel's back. That's the point that Joseph can't stand it anymore. And he says, it's me. I'm your brother. He puts everybody else out. And it says he weeps so loudly before them that all the Egyptians around, everybody that he's made leave and go outside and all of that, they hear him weeping. He's happy to see his brothers. Of all that they've done. I mean, they become fearful of what he's going to do at this point. They don't know what he's going to do. And he says, don't be afraid. And even to the point when he finally sends down and Pharaoh finds out about it and says, yeah, bring them all up. Give them the best of the land. I mean, they're sheep herders, and Egyptians don't like sheep herders. It says they are loathsome to them. And so they really don't care for people that are taking care of sheep. Give them the land of Goshen. Give them the best of the land and send them over there These are Joseph's family. These are Joseph's people. Bring them up. And so they do. Even to the point when Jacob finally dies, the brothers are afraid again. And you know what Joseph says to them? Yes, you sold me into slavery, but this was God's doing. Look at how many lives were saved that God did this. Would that be our response? Is that our kind of response when somebody betrays us? When somebody accuses us of something we didn't do? That our response is ultimately, and even through the whole process, otherwise how could Joseph have ever coped with all of this if he did not see it as God's will? If he didn't see it as God can use this? But he saw it all the way through, it seems, because we don't see Joseph at one point standing up and saying, "Why, God, are you doing this to me?" You don't see it. And he says, look at how many people were saved. And I don't think he's just talking about all of them. Look at how many people did not starve because he was sold into slavery. Look at how many people survived 7 years of famine that there would have been no food left for because they would have consumed what was there before. I mean, it's amazing. Pharaoh just keeps raking it in over this, and Joseph, as a manager, the people end up, as it goes, the years go along into this famine, they have absolutely nothing left, and they don't have any money left. They continue to buy this grain from Pharaoh. They don't have any money left, and so he says, well, do you have some livestock? And so they start bringing their livestock in, and so Pharaoh gains in livestock, and a lot of that goes down to the land of Goshen for the Israelites to take care of. And then they come in, they don't have any livestock left, but they're still hungry, they still need grain, and they say, okay, do you have any land? And they say, we have our land and we have ourselves. That's all we can pledge to you. We'll give ourselves as slaves, and we'll give our land. And so Pharaoh ends up not just being Pharaoh and king, he owns everything. And he owns the people. So they're all coming up there, except for the priest of the land. Everybody besides them. He owns it all. And Joseph and his family, live within a situation where Joseph's like the king. We're looking at all this. This story's there. We're familiar with it. But how does it apply to us? When things happen, and we're not even talking about the major things, but what if the major things do happen? How do we react? How do we respond? I don't know that I see us responding this way on Facebook. How about you? In something that is really pretty trivial. You think about Facebook. I get tired of looking at it and getting on there because there is so much of people's response that is completely opposite of this. Completely opposite. Is that how we're reacting in life to everything that comes our way? With bitterness and anger and malice because of what's happening to us. And it's not always us personally, us as a nation perhaps. We don't have to be happy with everything that we see happen around us. But what's our attitude about it? Are we in any way letting God work through it? Work through it in us. Because a lot of these things necessarily right now, may not be affecting us directly, but ultimately, yes, they could. So what would be our response? But what's our response when it happens at work? What's our response when it happens at school? What's our response when it happens at the gym or out on the golf course, or wherever it is that we may be, in Walmart, what is our response when things happen to us that aren't pleasant? Things happen to us that maybe would cause us to retaliate towards somebody else, to respond to somebody else in a negative way. And he gave us a pretty good example in Joseph. And it's interesting, Joseph responds, look how many people didn't starve because you sold me into slavery. I don't blame you. That's what he told his brothers. I don't blame you. We're fine. I have forgiven you. Even when their father died, and this was years later, when their father died. I mean, it was 17 years by the time when he came to Egypt before he died. 17 years has passed. The brothers are still afraid. Why do you think the brothers were still afraid? Probably because they knew what their response would have been had it been them. What about us? Would we be afraid? They were. One more passage and then we're going to quit. And I'm just going to read this, but hopefully it helps us see that there are going to be times, even as Joseph, and he had some times, and if Praise Team wants to come up, you guys can. It's not a long reading here. Even as Joseph had some times that perhaps it was God disciplining him, but perhaps it was simply putting him in positions that he could serve. But in Hebrews chapter 12, he says in verse 4, you have not resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin, and you have forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he scourges every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you endure. God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? But if you are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons.